The mud at Passchendaele did not behave like mud anywhere else on the Western Front. It swallowed men. It swallowed horses, guns, ammunition limbers, and the dead in equal measure, closing over them without ceremony, without a mark, without any acknowledgement that something had been there and was now gone. The drainage system that had kept the Flemish lowlands habitable for centuries had been obliterated by 3 years of continuous shelling, and what remained by the autumn of 1917 was a suspension of clay, standing water, and decomposed matter that could pull a man under in minutes if he stumbled off the narrow duckboard tracks that were the only reliable routes through the worst of it. Stretcher bearers reported losing their footing and watching patients slide beneath the surface before help could reach them. Engineers tasked with calculating the trafficability of the ground ran out of categories. No existing field manual had a classification for what the Ypres salient had become. The aerial photographs taken by the Royal Flying Corps over the Passchendaele Ridge in the late summer and autumn of 1917 show a landscape that does not register as agricultural land, as a village, or as a battlefield in any recognizable sense. There are no hedgerows, no field boundaries, no intact structures. There are shell craters, thousands of them, overlapping, merged into each other, filled with gray-green water that reflects the overcast Flemish sky. There are lines of duckboard that appear and disappear into the water without explanation. There are the small gray rectangles of the German concrete emplacements, the pillboxes, set into the higher ground of the ridge at irregular intervals calculated to provide interlocking fields of fire. And there is, at the center of the photographs, the ruin of what had been Passchendaele village, reduced to a scatter of brick rubble and broken timber on a slight rise that barely registers as elevated ground in photographs, but that represents, on the Flemish plain, a position of genuine tactical consequence. Men have been ordered to take that rise, repeatedly, from the end of July onward. The photographs record what happened to the ground they were required to cross. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. Into this landscape, in the last days of October, the Canadian Corps arrived. For divisions, roughly 100,000 men, transferred north from the Vimy sector at the direct order of Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, who needed the battle to show progress before the winter closed it down. The Third Battle of Ypres had been running since the 31st of July. British formations, Anzac divisions, and what remained of a number of county and Scottish regiments had sustained casualties that resisted easy summary. The ground taken, measured against those numbers, had been minimal. The German defensive system in the salient had adapted over months of combat into something qualitatively different for what the Allied command had anticipated when the offensive was planned in the spring. The Germans were not holding a line at Passchendaele. They were holding a zone, a deep, flexible arrangement of concrete strongpoints connected by underground passages, defended by pre-registered artillery and mortar fire, capable of yielding ground deliberately in some places, while holding it absolutely in others. An Allied assault could take one pillbox, or 3, or a section of trench, and the zone would absorb it, close around it, and present the same problem again from a slightly different angle. The men responsible for watching the edges of that zone, observing every approach, every fold of ground, every ruined farm track that a patrol or assault wave might attempt to use, were the soldiers of the German sniper and scout detachments attached to the divisions of Army Group Ruprecht. Those men had been working this ground since the battle opened in July. They knew it the way a gamekeeper knows a managed moor, not just its surface, but its logic. They understood which drainage patterns made certain routes unavoidable after heavy rain. They had mapped the angles of visibility from each piece of elevated ground and from each pillbox aperture. They had registered exact ranges from the forward positions to every fixed feature an attacker might instinctively use for navigation. A shattered tree stump, a ruined wall corner, the wreckage of a farm cart that had been lying in the same shell hole since the previous winter. The casualty returns from British and Anzac units during the approach and assault phases of the summer and early autumn operations document what this accumulated knowledge cost. Officers leading reconnaissance parties forward were frequently killed within the first 200 yards of the British forward line, shot by men whose positions they could not locate and whose observation of the approach ground was comprehensive and patient. The German sniper positions were sited not at the outer edge of the defensive zone, but well back inside it, protected by the concrete emplacements and by their own forward observers who watched the broken ground the attackers had to cross. The approach to Passchendaele was the killing ground. This was the situation the Canadian Corps inherited when it came north. General Arthur Currie, commanding the Corps, was not a man who accepted inherited situations without systematic examination. He had built his reputation at Vimy Ridge in April of that year, and the methods he had used there, meticulous ground preparation, thorough artillery planning integrated at every level from corps to platoon, the use of his own intelligence resources to understand the German defensive scheme before a single infantryman went forward, had become the foundation of a corps culture that treated preparation not as a desirable extra, but as a baseline requirement. When Haig tasked him with taking Passchendaele, Currie told the field marshal directly that the operation as currently conceived would fail at unacceptable cost. He put his estimate of Canadian casualties at 16,000 men. Haig's staff thought the figure excessive. Currie was, in the event, nearly exactly right. His conditions for accepting the task included adequate time for preparation, proper artillery registration on German positions, and the freedom to use his own reconnaissance assets to develop a detailed intelligence picture of the ground before any assault went in. This last condition mattered most to Currie, because he understood something that British Army planning at the senior level had not yet fully absorbed. Planning done from maps and photographs, however good those maps and photographs were, could not substitute for knowledge of the actual ground as it stood on the day the assault went forward. Someone had to walk the approaches. Someone had to find the routes the maps could not show and the photographs could not resolve, and to locate the German positions not from altitude but from close at ground level, in conditions that matched the conditions of the assault itself. The unit that would do that work was drawn from the Corps' established reconnaissance structure. Each Canadian division maintained a scout section of roughly platoon strength, and these sections were coordinated at corps level through a staff branch that had been developing its methods and institutional knowledge since 1915. What these sections represented by October 1917 was not simply a collection of capable soldiers willing to go forward at night. They represented a coherent method of ground reconnaissance worked out through hard operational experience and adapted specifically to the conditions of the Western Front. The method was, in a specific context of trench warfare on ground like Passchendaele, ahead of anything else the British Expeditionary Force was fielding in a systematic way. The evolution of that method is worth tracing because it explains the capability the German sniper detachments were about to encounter. The early Canadian Volunteer Force had drawn heavily from the Canadian interior, the northern provinces, the prairie country, the shield country east and west of the Great Lakes. Among the men who found their way into scout roles, there was a substantial proportion who had grown up in a working relationship with difficult terrain that had no equivalent in the experience of men from British urban or even agricultural backgrounds. Trappers, hunters, prospectors, and guides. Men whose working lives had required the ability to move through dense or open country without being seen or heard, to read landscape for information rather than simply for direction, to maintain concentration across hours of enforced stillness, and to function for extended periods without the routine support of settled life. The Army did not give these men their fieldcraft. It gave it a structure, a purpose, and the equipment that made it militarily useful. The formal scout training program that the Corps developed at its schools built on this foundation, with systematic instruction and observation technique, sketch map production, compass and dead reckoning navigation at night, and the specific demands of working in the forward zone of a defended position. Trainees learned to navigate without fixed landmarks, since using a visible feature for orientation often meant exposing themselves in a predictable location. They learned to read disturbed ground, the difference between a shell hole that had simply filled with water and one that had been recently worked, the subtle compression of mud that indicated regular foot traffic on a route that appeared to go nowhere. They learned to maintain direction across ground where the compass was the only reference, and every feature looked identical in the dark. And they learned the discipline of stillness, that the most dangerous thing a scout could do, in a position close to the enemy, was move before the situation permitted it. The doctrine that emerged from this training rested on a principle the instructors called negative movement. The German sniper worked by waiting for his target to produce evidence of itself. A shadow crossing an opening, the glint of optical equipment, the disturbance of ground cover, a sound inconsistent with the ambient noise of the sector. He was patient, trained, and operating on ground he had prepared for exactly this purpose. The Canadian scouts inverted this by refusing to be the thing the German observer was watching for. A patrol that took 4 hours to cover 300 yards of broken ground was not a slow patrol. It was a successful one, because it had covered those 300 yards without producing the evidence that would have made a target. The practical execution of this principle on Passchendaele ground required something beyond technique. It required a specific quality of attention, the ability to read the ground ahead for what the evidence showed about who had been on it recently and from what direction, to assess the risk of each 10-yard move before making it, and to hold the overall purpose of the patrol in mind across hours of physical discomfort and psychological strain. The scouts who worked the Passchendaele approaches in October of 1917 were operating in cold rain, in near total darkness, through mud that grabbed at every limb, within hearing distance of positions they knew were manned by men trained to detect exactly what they were doing. The accounts they left, sparse as they are, reflect not fear, but concentration. The work demanded everything available, and there was nothing left over for reflection. The German approach to sniping and forward observation by 1917 was serious and systematized. The Army had established dedicated sniper training schools in 1915, following early experience on both fronts that demonstrated the value of trained marksmen with matched optical equipment. Graduates returned to their divisions with Currie 98 rifles fitted with quality telescopic sights, with standardized training and range estimation, wind reading, and the identification of targets by function and role, and with a set of fieldcraft procedures that were, by the standards of any army in the field at that stage, sophisticated. Routes that earlier formations had improvised under fire had been selected in advance. Positions that had caught preceding attacks and enfilade had been located and addressed in the opening minutes of the advance. The infantry moved with different knowledge of the ground it was crossing. The German Fourth Army's own assessment of the First Canadian Assault, preserved in intelligence summaries at the Bundesarchivmilitararchiv in Freiburg, noted the change in Canadian tactical behavior with precision. A late October summary records that Canadian patrol activity in the days preceding the assault had demonstrated an unusual degree of familiarity with the forward defensive zone. The document uses the phrase systematic ground preparation to describe what had preceded the Canadian attack. It identifies the destruction of several forward observation posts in the opening minutes of the advance as evidence of that preparation, posts that had functioned effectively against earlier attacks for months. The sniper detachments, the summary notes specifically, suffered disproportionate casualties in the initial phase, attributed to precise prior knowledge of positions. This was written for internal consumption within the German command, not shaped for any external audience. The Canadians had found them before the battle started. The 10 days between the 1st and 2nd Canadian assaults were used by the scout sections almost exactly as the preceding preparation period had been. Night patrol continued without interruption. Intelligence was consolidated as it came in. The ground picture was updated as German positions shifted in response to the losses of the 26th. The German command had responded with standard operational practice, relocating exposed forward positions, establishing new hides and ground the Canadians had not yet reached, adjusting observation patterns to account for the changed defensive line. Sound doctrine, but establishing a new sniper or observation position properly takes time. The observation arcs must be verified in both daylight and darkness. Ranges to key features must be confirmed by observation rather than calculation alone. The ambient patterns of the ground in front of the position, what constitutes normal activity, what registers as abnormal, what indicates a patrol, and what indicates an imminent assault, require days of watching to build from scratch. The Canadian scouts found the new positions before that situational knowledge had been fully developed, and the information fed into the fire plan for the 30th of October. By the second assault, the German sniper detachment's operational behavior had changed in ways the Corps intelligence summaries recorded. Pairs that had previously held their positions through the preliminary bombardments, standard practice, drawing on the substantial protection the concrete emplacements provided, were withdrawing earlier, before the barrage reached their areas. Watch logs maintained right up to the moment of earlier assaults were being abandoned with time to spare. In intelligence terms, this signature is unambiguous. It means the men in those positions had stopped trusting their cover. They had concluded that their coordinates were known, that the opening bombardment would be placed accordingly, and that remaining in position until the last moment was no longer the rational calculation it had been against preceding formations. The systematic patrol work had produced a second-order effect beyond the direct value of the intelligence itself. It had made the German sniper detachments uncertain about their own security. Uncertain men are less effective men. The use of standing patrols in the hours immediately before each assault is documented across several battalion war diaries from the Passchendaele period. These were not reconnaissance operations. Their function was observation and real-time reporting of German movement in the final hours before each hour. Pairs of scouts in positions identified during the preceding night's work, close enough to the German forward zone to see movement within it. What they reported: routes being reinforced or evacuated, positions being manned at unusual times, the presence or absence of normal German patrol traffic, fed directly into last-minute adjustments to the fire plan, and, in at least 2 cases documented in the Corps intelligence summaries, into revisions of assault lane assignments made in the final hours before the advance. The information was specific enough and arrived early enough to act on. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The German army was running comparable forward observation operations. Their observers watched the Canadian lines during the preparatory phase and sent back reports on everything they could see. The difference, by the 2nd and 3rd Canadian assaults, was that the German observers were working from positions whose security they could no longer be certain of, while the Canadian standing patrol pairs operated from positions the German system had not found. This asymmetry accumulated across 3 weeks of Canadian operations in ways the tactical results reflect plainly. The final Canadian assault, on the 10th of November, took what remained of Passchendaele village. The ruins themselves presented a different problem from the open approach ground. Close terrain, multiple potential fighting positions in every fragment of standing structure, and the near certainty that the German command had adapted the village for exactly this phase of the fighting. The scout preparation for this phase was the densest of the 3 operations. The sections that worked the approaches to the village in the nights before the final assault produced sketch maps at a level of detail unusual even by the standards the Corps had established. Specific positions within the ruins were identified and assigned suppression tasks in the fire plan. Particular walls, cellar openings, the remnants of the church structure, a section of collapsed masonry on the western edge of the village that the scouts identified as providing both cover and a clear sight line over the final approach. The German army had understood earlier than most that a single well-positioned rifleman with the right equipment, adequate patience, and a thorough knowledge of his specific ground could dominate a section of front out of all proportion to his numbers. Their snipers worked in pairs, a shooter and an observer, alternating roles across shifts to preserve concentration. They rotated positions on schedules designed to prevent the pattern recognition that an attentive opponent might develop over time. In quiet sectors, this system had operated with near-complete dominance against formations that had no comparable response. In active sectors like Passchendaele, the same principles applied with appropriate adaptation. German sniper pairs operated from positions prepared in the pillbox network and from carefully maintained hides in the ruins of the village and in the waterlogged ground to its south and west. Their observers kept systematic watch logs, recording the time, map location, and estimated identity of every figure observed in the Allied forward areas. These logs were consolidated at battalion level into pattern analyses that shaped shooting priorities and informed the placement of new hides as conditions changed. It was methodical, evidence-driven work, and it had been functioning effectively for months before the Canadians arrived. The preparatory scout operations for the Passchendaele assaults began in the last days of October. Currie's staff had identified the German pillbox positions from the RFC aerial photographs accumulated since July and had constructed a map picture of the defensive zone that was, by the standards of what photographic interpretation could achieve in 1917, quite good. What it could not show was the internal logic of the zone, how the positions related to each other in practical terms, what ground between them was genuinely covered by fire, and what was dead ground from the pillbox apertures, where the connecting routes ran, which positions were most heavily manned at which hours, and where the sniper and observation posts were sited in relation to the main defensive structure. That information had to come from the ground itself. The scout patrols went out every night for 10 days before the first Canadian assault. The operational logs preserved in the war diaries of the relevant battalions and in the Corps intelligence summary files record specifics in the spare language of military reporting. Patrols of 2 to 4 men, moving without predetermined routes, where route fixing would have required crossing exposed ground at predictable points. Equipment was minimal: a prismatic compass, a small notebook, a grease pencil, and weapons. Officers and NCOs leading these patrols drew sketch maps on return, working from memory and from notes made during movement, and these maps were consolidated at battalion and divisional intelligence sections into a picture of the German forward zone more detailed than months of aerial observation had produced. The German sniper and observation positions were central to what the patrols sought. In the sectors assigned to the 1st and 2nd Canadian Divisions, the scout sections identified 4 confirmed sniper hides over the preparatory period, each cross-referenced across multiple patrol reports until the evidence was unambiguous. One position, in the remains of a farm structure approximately 400 yards northeast of Source Farm, had been responsible for a disproportionate concentration of officer casualties during the preceding British operations in this area. The scouts established its location not by direct observation of the hide, but by reconstructing the geometry of the shots attributed to it. The sight lines it must have commanded, given the locations where casualties had occurred, the elevation and angle consistent with wound evidence and witness accounts, the absence of any other structure in the relevant area that could have provided both the cover and the operational range the shooting had demonstrably required. They did not see the rifle. They read the ground around it until the ground told them where the rifle had to be. This method matters. Going directly toward a confirmed sniper position on ground the defender has prepared surrenders every advantage to the defense. The Canadian method was to understand the position through the evidence it had left in the surrounding ground, to map the approaches that bypassed its primary observation arcs, and to act on that understanding through the assault fire plan rather than through independent countersniper action. Artillery suppression tasks timed to the minute against the identified positions were incorporated into the fire plan for each assault. The goal was not to neutralize each hide in isolation before the battle. The goal was to ensure that each hide was suppressed precisely at the moment the assault infantry crossed the ground it covered. The planning documents for the 1st Canadian assault on the 26th of October show how the scout intelligence was integrated at every level. Suppression tasks for the supporting artillery were tied to specific coordinates drawn from the scout sketch maps, timed relative to the advance of the assault waves across the ground those positions commanded. The approach lanes assigned to each assaulting company reflected routes the scouts had identified as viable during the 10 nights of preparatory patrol. Not the most direct lines, not the routes that would have been selected from maps alone, but the specific paths through shell holes and drainage channels that permitted some degree of concealment for the critical phases of the approach. Staff officers who had not walked the ground trusted these maps with battalion-strength assault waves. The trust was repaid. The assault on the 26th produced gains that surprised British Army headquarters, which had watched its own formations take catastrophic losses against the same ground since July. The Canadians took Bellevue Spur and declined Copse, and they held what they took. The casualty figures were still severe. Passchendaele ground did not become safer because a competent force was crossing it, but the ratio of ground gained to men lost was measurably better than anything achieved in the preceding phase over comparable distances. After-action reports from divisional and corps headquarters were specific about the contributing factors. The German snipers who had worked the Passchendaele ground since July understood its dangers better than any newcomer could. They had built their knowledge over months, recording it in watch logs and range cards, and the experience of men who had been doing this specific work in this specific terrain through summer heat and autumn rain and the first frosts. What they had not previously encountered was a force that spent the weeks before the assault acquiring the same quality of knowledge from the inside, using methods their system had no prepared response to. The training pipeline that produced the scouts at Passchendaele had been running for 2 years, and its curriculum reflected every hard lesson the Corps had absorbed in that time. At the Corps Scout School, which operated behind the lines in rotation through the Vimy and Arras sectors before the move north, candidates underwent a 3-week program that washed out roughly a third of those who began it. The failures were not physical. Most men who attempted the course were fit enough for the demands of patrol work. The failures were attentional. Men who could move quietly, but could not sustain the observation discipline required to work close to a prepared defensive position for hours without taking a shortcut, without making the small habitual move that would give them away. The instructors understood that the most dangerous moment in any patrol was not the approach but the pause, the period when the scout was in position, close to the objective, and the instinctive human desire to move, to act, to resolve the tension of proximity had to be overridden by the trained decision to wait and observe. Candidates were assessed on their ability to produce accurate sketch maps from memory after a timed observation exercise, on their compass accuracy across distances of up to half a mile in the dark, and on what the instructors called negative contact, completing a patrol exercise past a manned observation post without being detected. Failure in the negative contact exercise meant immediate elimination from the course, regardless of performance in every other element. The logic was straightforward. A scout who could produce excellent sketch maps, but could not move without being detected was not a scout. He was a casualty with good handwriting. The scouts who graduated from this course and went forward to the Passchendaele preparation were not exceptional men in the biographical sense. They were not decorated veterans or famous figures in the war's record. They were corporals and sergeants, and a small number of lieutenants whose names appear in battalion nominal rolls without special annotation. What made them operationally significant was not anything that distinguished them in the conventional metrics of military service, but the specific combination of natural aptitude, acquired technique, and accumulated experience that the Corps' training system had developed and selected for over 2 years. They were the product of an institution that had decided to take ground reconnaissance seriously, to invest in it systematically, and to improve it on the basis of what the evidence showed. The sketch maps they produced during the Passchendaele preparation have not survived complete in the public record. What has survived are the compiled intelligence summaries built from those maps, held at Library and Archives Canada, in the RG9 series of the Canadian Expeditionary Force records. The summaries are detailed documents. They record grid coordinates, estimated personnel strengths at identified positions, the times at which specific positions were observed to be manned or unoccupied, the condition of routes between positions, and in several cases the specific evidence, a disturbed shell hole, a worn approach track, a position from which ground cover had been recently cut to clear sight lines, that led to the identification of a particular hide. Reading these summaries, it is possible to reconstruct something of the picture the Corps built up across those 10 nights, and to understand why the German command, until it had suffered 2 assaults, found it difficult to believe the Canadians knew as much as they did. The German response to the first assault included not only the tactical adjustment of relocating exposed positions, but also an intensification of their own forward patrol activity. German patrols pushed closer to the Canadian forward positions in the interval between the first and second assaults, attempting to build an equivalent picture of the Canadian defensive layout. The Corps intelligence summaries from this period note increased German patrol activity in the forward zone and document several encounters in which Canadian standing patrols detected German reconnaissance parties without initiating contact. The decision not to engage was deliberate. Engaging a German patrol in the forward zone would confirm the location of the Canadian observation position, destroying the intelligence asset for the remainder of the preparatory period. The scouts reported what they saw and remained in place. The German patrols, finding nothing that gave them a fix on the Canadian forward layout, withdrew without the information they had been sent to collect. This is a small detail, recorded in a handful of patrol reports and intelligence entries, but it illustrates the asymmetry clearly. The Canadian scouts were not simply better at moving quietly than their German counterparts. They were operating within a system that had thought through the consequences of every decision made in the forward zone, and had given its men clear guidance on how to weigh immediate tactical opportunity against the longer-term value of keeping the intelligence operation intact. Engaging a German patrol was a natural impulse. Watching it withdraw empty-handed was more useful. The inter-assault period also produced one of the more striking episodes in the Passchendaele scout record. On the night of the 1st of November, a 2-man patrol from the 2nd Canadian Division Scout Section penetrated the German forward zone to a depth estimated at 300 yards beyond the furthest point the assault infantry had reached on the 26th. Their objective was to establish the extent to which the German defensive layout in that area had been reorganized since the fighting. They were in position for approximately 4 hours. German divisional records from this phase document the final assault from the other side. Officers of the two divisions defending the village, the 11th Division and the Guard Reserve Division, reported that the Canadian assault of the 10th of November arrived with an accuracy they had not encountered in the preceding phase of the battle. Positions were located after the 2nd Canadian attack, which the German command had reason to believe were unknown to the attackers, were engaged in the opening minutes. The village fell by early afternoon. The garrison that had held Passchendaele against attacks for 3 months was overrun in hours. The Fourth Army's subsequent operational assessment identified systematic ground preparation as the central distinguishing factor between the Canadian phase of the Third Battle of Ypres and everything that had preceded it. This conclusion was reached during the battle itself, in real time, by men trying to understand why a defensive system that had been working was no longer working against this particular opponent. The answer they arrived at was that the Canadians had found them, repeatedly, before the fighting started, and had used what they found in ways their own system had not anticipated. The physical cost of the Passchendaele operations was severe. The Canadian Corps sustained approximately 15,600 casualties across the 3 assaults, a figure that Currie had predicted with near-exact accuracy before the first man went forward. The ground taken at that cost was the ridge, the village, the slight elevation the British command had deemed strategically necessary. The question of whether it was worth the price is one the historical record raises, and the historical record cannot answer with certainty. What the record does answer is this. On ground where preceding formations had spent far more men for smaller gains, the Canadians took their objectives, in 3 assaults over 3 weeks, by methods that produced a measurably different outcome than anything achieved on the same terrain in the same battle. The difference is not explained by any quality of courage or resilience that distinguished Canadian soldiers from British or Anzac soldiers, whose conduct in the earlier phase of the battle had been beyond reproach. It is explained by preparation, and at the center of that preparation were the scout sections and the work they did in the dark before the assaults began. The men who ran those patrols left sparse personal records. The nature of the work, the long stillness, the discipline of operating close to the enemy without producing evidence of presence, the sustained attention required to read ground for information not visible to the untrained eye, did not produce the kind of correspondence that builds a personal archive. A few accounts survive in regimental histories and in the papers collected by the Canadian War Records Office during and after the war. They share a quality unusual in soldiers' memoirs. The men who describe the patrols are more interested in the ground than in themselves. They describe routes, specific features used for navigation in the dark, the evidence that told them where German positions were. The experience of covering 300 yards of Flemish clay in 4 hours, alone or with one other man, carrying a compass and a grease pencil, knowing that sound would bring fire. This is largely absent for what they chose to write down. Sergeant William Lister, whose name appears in several of the Scout Section war diaries from the Passchendaele period, gave an account to the Canadian War Records Office in 1918. He described a patrol on the night of the 28th of October, 2 days after the first assault, on which his section located a new German sniper hide established between the 2 attacks to replace a position destroyed in the fighting of the 26th. The hide was in a partially drained shell hole, on slightly elevated ground east of Crest Farm. Lister's account focuses on the evidence. The site lines the position commanded, the elevation relative to the known approach routes, the fresh disturbance of the ground around the shell hole that distinguished it from the hundreds of similar craters nearby. The section did not engage the position. They marked it on their sketch map and withdrew. The position was addressed by fire the following morning. Whether the sniper pair was present at the time is not recorded, and Lister did not speculate. His job had been to find the position. He found it. The rest was someone else's work. What the Corps Intelligence Summary for that week records, in the flat language of military administration, is a measurable decline in German sniper activity in the 2nd Canadian Division sector between the 1st and 2nd assaults, attributed to successful neutralization of forward observation and shooting positions through ground intelligence. The language carries no apparent weight. Behind are the nights in the mud, the sketch maps drawn from memory in dim light on a man's knee, the men who found positions by reading the ground until the ground told them where to look. The doctrine the Canadian Corps had developed since 1915 would take the broader British Army years to absorb in full. Its influence spread through post-war staff studies, through the testimony of Canadian officers at various commissions that examined the lessons of the war, and through the writing of officers like Brigadier General James Hamar Greenfield, who had been involved in the Corps' intelligence operations and who spent years afterward making a single argument in papers and lectures, that the assault infantry is the last element of an attack, not the first. The first element is the man who walks the ground the assault must cross and returns with the truth of what is on it. Without that truth, the finest artillery plan is a calculation built on assumptions. With it, the plan becomes something the ground can actually support. The truth of Passchendaele was that the ground was, by ordinary reckoning, impassable. The truth the scouts brought back from it was that it was not uniformly impassable, that there were routes, and that the German defensive system, for all its sophistication, had the same limitation any human-built system carries: blind spots. And those blind spots could be found by a man patient and skilled enough to look for them in the right way, in the right conditions, without announcing himself. The sketch maps the scouts drew in the mud have not survived in the public record as individual documents. They were working materials, not archival ones, consumed by the planning process and discarded or lost in the movement of the campaign. What survives is what they produced, the fire plans they shaped, the assault lanes they identified, the suppression tasks that were placed at the right coordinates at the right time, because someone had been close enough to those coordinates in the dark to confirm that the position was there. The men who produced that information are listed in the nominal rolls of their battalions, indistinguishable on paper from any other private soldier or corporal or sergeant who served in the Passchendaele operations. No special entry marks what they did. No citation singles them out as a group. What does single them out is the record of what their work produced, measured against what had been achieved on the same ground without it. That comparison is in the operational files. It has been in the operational files since November of 1917. The ground at Passchendaele has long since been drained, farmed, and returned to something that looks, from a distance, like the landscape it was before the war. The ridge is there. The slight rise where the village stood is there. The records of what it cost to take them, and of the men who made the cost fractionally less than it might have been by going out in the dark and learning the ground before anyone else had to cross it. Those records are there too. They decided things. The record does not forget. Neither should we. Thank you for staying with this until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one. The patrol report, filed on return in the early morning of the 2nd of November, described the layout of 3 defensive positions in that area with a detail that divisional headquarters staff annotated as the most operationally useful single patrol report of the entire preparatory period. One of the 2 men is recorded in the war diary as having returned with a minor wound he had not reported until after completing his sketch map and patrol report. The circumstances that produced the wound are not described. He returned to patrol duties 5 days later. The operational inheritance of the Passchendaele scout work extended beyond the immediate campaign. The methods the Canadian Corps had demonstrated and the results they had produced were studied at the British Army staff level in the months that followed. The formal incorporation of systematic ground reconnaissance into assault planning doctrine, at a depth comparable to what the Canadians had shown was possible, was slow and uneven in its broader adoption. What the Canadian record demonstrated, with the clarity the after-action reports preserved, was that the cost of proper preparation was less than the cost of its absence. That lesson was in the record. It remained there. The village of Passchendaele was retaken by German forces in the spring offensive of 1918 and recovered by Belgian forces in the autumn of the same year. The ridge changed hands enough times that the question of what it cost any side to hold it resists clean calculation. What the Canadian operations of October and November 1917 established was more durable than a position on a map. It was a proof of method, entered into the record at a cost inscribed name by name at the Menin Gate at Ypres, demonstrating that the preparation of the ground before an assault, real preparation, by men with specific skills and the patience to use them without shortcut, was not an enhancement of good operational planning, but its necessary foundation. The broader picture of what the German sniper detachments experienced at Passchendaele is recoverable, partially, from the divisional war diaries of the units that held the sector across the Canadian phase of the battle. The diary of the 11th Division, which bore the weight of the 1st and 2nd Canadian assaults, contains several entries in late October and early November that speak directly to the changed conditions the snipers were working under. An entry from approximately the 29th of October, 2 days after the first assault, notes that forward observation activity has been disrupted by the loss of 3 confirmed positions in the opening phase of the Canadian attack, and that replacement positions are being established, but that patrol security in the approaches to these positions cannot currently be guaranteed. The language of military bureaucracy, but the meaning is precise. The Germans did not know whether the Canadians were watching the new positions being built. The reasonable assumption, given what had just happened to the old ones, was that they were. An entry from early November in the same diary notes that sniper pairs operating in a sector covering the approach to Crest Farm are being pulled back from their advanced positions during the hours of darkness following reports that Canadian patrols have been active in that area. The operational consequence was that the extended observation coverage those positions had provided was no longer being maintained through the night hours. An observation post that pulls back from its advanced position at dusk and reoccupies it after first light is an observation post that is blind for the hours when attacker patrol work is most productive. The Canadian scouts had not destroyed these positions. They had made them too uncertain to man at the hours that mattered most. The cumulative intelligence picture the Corps had assembled by the eve of the third and final assault on the 10th of November was qualitatively different from what had been available before the first. Not because the ground had changed, Passchendaele ground did not improve, but because the 10 days of continuous patrol work between each assault had closed the gaps that the initial picture left. The German defensive zone had been mapped, position by position, across 3 separate phases of patrol activity. Each phase found what the previous phase had missed, tracked what the previous phase had noted as uncertain, and confirmed or corrected the assessments the previous phase had produced. By the morning of the 10th of November, the fire plan for the assault on the village incorporated a level of positional specificity that the RFC aerial photographs alone could never have supported. The final assault success, measured not in the romantic sense, but in the operational sense of achieving the assigned objective with casualties below those sustained in comparable operations on the same ground, was the cumulative product of that 3-phase intelligence cycle. Each patrol that went out and came back added something to the picture. Each sketch map that was consolidated at the intelligence section refined the understanding of where the threat was and how it could be addressed. The men who made those patrols did not know, in most cases, how their specific contribution fitted into the larger picture. They were told the objective, they were given their approach route, they were trained in the techniques required, and they went. What they brought back was processed by the intelligence staff and fed into the planning by the artillery and infantry officers. The chain worked because every link in it was built on the same foundation. The decision, made by Currie and sustained by every level of the Corps below him, that the ground had to be known before the assault went in, and that knowing the ground required men who could go out and learn it in the dark. The Scout Section War Diaries from Passchendaele are held at Library and Archives Canada in Ottawa in the RG9 series of the Canadian Expeditionary Force Records. The German 4th Army intelligence summaries from the same weeks are at the Bundesarchiv Militärarchiv in Freiburg. Read together, they tell the same story from opposite ends of the wire. A method was applied, ground was learned, and men who had owned the knowledge of that ground found they no longer owned it entirely, because other men had spent 10 nights in the dark acquiring it.